Hi, my name is Naomi Reyes, and that night, at my own MBA graduation dinner, my father stood up in the middle of an elegant restaurant, smiled before dozens of guests, and said, "Today, I officially pass the leadership of Reyes Modular Build to Madison Reyes." The room erupted in applause. My sister burst into tears. And I, the one who had spent 7 years building every wall, every blueprint, every contract that turned that company into an empire, could only sit there, smiling, as if I'd just been congratulated. But that night, I made a decision no one expected. I walked away. I joined the very client my family used to brag about having, and then I watched our company crumble piece by piece. Not out of hatred, but out of justice, the kind that only truth can bring. If it were you, could you still smile while watching your own family strip away the work of your entire life? I'm Naomi, and I'd love to know where you're watching this story from. Share your story in the comments, so I know I'm not alone in this feeling. I was born and raised in Lakewood, Colorado, in a family where the sounds of drills, hammers, and the sharp scent of welding metal were the lullabies of my childhood. My family owned a small construction company called Reyes Modular Build, or RMB, as locals like to call it. The name was everywhere. Stitched on my father's work jacket, painted on the white truck parked in front of our house, and printed on the yellow hard hat I used to sneak on when I was 12. From a young age, I believed that if I studied hard enough and worked the right way, my father would one day see me as part of that legacy. My father, Robert Reyes, was the second-generation head of the company. Broad-shouldered, deep-voiced, and commanding, the kind of man whose eyes didn't invite disagreement. To him, a leader was someone who spoke so others would act. At every meeting, he'd stand in the center of the room, finger-tracing blueprints, his voice echoing across the space, while employees and subcontractors nodded along. He was proud of his ability to talk to clients and make them believe. Lager. My mother, Elaine, was the one behind the office desk doing the books, balancing every invoice down to the cent. She cared deeply about appearances, Sunday church attendance, neatly arranged dinner tables, polished family manners. For her, everything had to look right: the food, the invitations, even how we behaved in public. I grew up between those two forces, a father who believed in words and a mother who believed in appearances. I have an older sister, Madison, 3 years my senior. She was the perfect miniature version of my mother, with that charming, camera-ready smile and a natural gift for appearing at just the right moment in every family photo. She studied communications in Austin, Texas, and my parents always called her the born leader. I was nothing like her. I liked watching things take shape under my own hands: concrete, steel, the precision of numbers. When I enrolled at the University of Colorado Boulder, I chose to major in civil engineering, specializing in energy-efficient modular structures. My friends laughed. Why would a girl choose something so dry? They teased. I only smiled. I believed in something my father once told me when I was little, after I helped him tighten a loose screw on our staircase. Doesn't matter what you do, just make it solid. I carried those words for years, even though he was the first person to forget them. The summer I turned 21, my father called me back to intern at Reyes Modular Build, the company's main construction site. He said, "You'll learn more here than any classroom can teach you." I remember that first day vividly. It was July, hot, dry, the kind of heat that made asphalt shimmer like melted glass. I stood in the middle of the site with a thick roll of blueprints in my arms, hands coated in dust, sweat sliding down the bridge of my nose. In the distance, Madison was laughing, posing for a promotional shoot for the company, wearing a spotless new hard hat and a fresh RMB logo shirt. A whole photo crew followed her. My father stood nearby, watching her with pride, nodding approvingly. That was the first time I clearly saw the line between us, the invisible wall that separated those who built something to make it stand, and those who simply stood beside it to be seen. My father assigned me to the technical crew. "Let's see what you can handle," he said. I knew what that meant, a polite way to let his daughter be on site without getting in anyone's way. I didn't argue. I just got to work measuring loads, checking foundations, calculating concrete slump ratios, recording every figure in neat rows. Every now and then, I'd see Madison again, walking around with clients, clipboard in hand, speaking confidently even though she clearly didn't understand half the schematics. My father looked at her with pride. I once overheard him tell a client, "She's got real leadership instincts, knows how to talk to people." I ebb. As for me? He'd introduce me casually. "That's my younger one, she's studying engineering." But strangely, I didn't feel hurt. I believed that if I just did things right, eventually he'd see me. That first afternoon, I stayed late at the site, helping a few of the workers finish the steel framing. One of them asked, "Hey, is the intern the boss's daughter?" I laughed. "Yeah, but don't tell him that. I want to work like everyone else." An older worker looked at me, then nodded slowly. "If you can keep that spirit," he said, "every structure you build will stand strong." I never forgot that sentence. For the next 3 months, the construction site became my whole world. I learned how to read complex blueprints, correct structural deviations, and estimate material costs. I began to realize that every steel plate, every weld, every hammer strike was its own kind of language, silent, but more precise than any words could ever be. And I loved that language. But I also started to notice the difference. When I talked to my father about load-bearing calculations or how modular design could reduce costs, he'd just nod vaguely and say, "Let the senior engineers check that." But when Madison suggested that the company brochure should be blue because it feels more feng shui, he immediately nodded. "Good idea, that's smart marketing." One late afternoon, when the crew was wrapping up for the day, I stood watching the steel skeleton of the building take shape. The wind carried the smell of hot metal and cement dust. My father walked up, put a hand on my shoulder, and said, "You did well. But remember this, people don't remember who poured the concrete, they only remember who cuts the ribbon." I pressed my lips together. He didn't know I etched that line into my heart like a mark carved in cold metal. That night, I came home and saw Madison's new post online. "Proud to represent our family business, Reyes Modular Build." Hundreds of comments flooded in praise, heart emojis, congratulations. Then I saw my father's comment beneath it. "So proud of you, sweetheart." Not me. Her. I just sat there, staring at the screen with hands still covered in dust and steel grime, thinking maybe fairness, in my family, was a structure that had never been built right. That night, I opened my laptop and saved all the modular design blueprints and notes I'd been developing into a private folder. I named it I-beam after the core steel beam that holds an entire frame together. A small name, but to me, it represented the one part of the company that was truly mine. I didn't know then that this quiet act would change the course of my life forever. From that summer on, I understood something profound. Some people are born to be seen, and some of us have to build to be heard. I never needed the spotlight, but I needed fairness. And from that moment on, my nature was set precise, silent, and no longer believing that the spotlight was a measure of worth. After graduating from college, I officially returned to my father's company this time, not as an intern, but as a full-fledged engineer. I came back with a proposal I had spent my entire senior year at CU Boulder developing. I-beam modular sequencing, a system designed to optimize modular assembly, cutting construction time and costs by nearly 18%. I remember that morning, vividly, the day I presented the idea in my father's office. He sat behind his wooden desk, arms crossed, his expression caught somewhere between curiosity and restraint. When I finished my sentence, "We can build 1 floor in 3 days instead of 5, he nodded slightly and said, "That's interesting. But clients don't buy formulas, Naomi. They buy confidence. Let's see how Madison can present it." I didn't react. I just turned to look out the window, where a line of R&B trucks was parked under the sundae. I understood, once again, that he didn't see me as an innovator, only as the technical one on the team. But I was used to that by now. 3 months later, R&B won the bid for the Summit 1 complex, the largest commercial project we'd ever taken on. The client was Carrington Urban Partners, a well-known real estate development group in Denver. I reviewed the contract my father had signed. In the technical appendix, he had written, "Innovative assembly technology developed by the RMB engineering team." No mention of me. Not a single word. But that was fine, I told myself. As long as the project succeeded, people would eventually see who was behind the numbers. From that moment on, my life was swallowed whole by that site. I worked from 7 in the morning until late at night, sometimes sleeping in the small office container on site. I was in charge of all structural load calculations, safety coordination, and progress tracking. Meanwhile, Madison was assigned by my father to handle communications for the project, meaning she was the one in every photo shoot, every press release, every groundbreaking event. My father loved telling clients, "My older daughter handles the vision, the younger one handles the details." That phrase, "the younger one," always cut a little, no matter how many times I heard it. The first morning Carrington arrived at the construction site, their CEO, Glenn Whitaker, stepped out of a black car and shook my father's hand. As they toured the lot, Madison walked beside them, chatting, laughing, playing her part perfectly while I stood off to the side, checking the foundation measurements. Glenn stopped when he saw me bent over my clipboard and asked, "Are you the lead engineer?" I replied simply, "Technical lead." He nodded thoughtfully. "So you're the one who came up with that I-beam system, right?" I froze for half a second. "Yes," I said. "That's me." He smiled. "Good, we chose Reyes because of your engineering, not your marketing." I looked up, and for the first time, I saw someone truly recognize the value of what I'd built. Over the next few months, Summit One began to rise from the ground like a living sculpture of metal and precision. Each floor came together seamlessly, modules locking into place with millimeter accuracy. The technical crew jokingly called me the I-beam girl. I didn't mind, I was just happy everything worked exactly as calculated. But the higher the building grew, the more I felt myself being pushed to the edges. Every local paper, every industry blog featured Madison's name. Madison Reyes, the young face of Colorado's construction future. How? If my name appeared at all, it was buried in the technical appendix at the back of the reports. That's when I started realizing I needed to protect what I had created. One evening, during dinner, I asked my father, "Can we register the I-beam system for copyright? Just to make sure the company's ownership is clear." He looked up from his plate and chuckled lightly. "No need, sweetheart. Everything you make belongs to the company, and the company is family. Don't overcomplicate things." Free. I nodded quietly. But that night, I opened my laptop and registered a small personal LLC, I-beam Methods LLC. In the operating terms, I wrote, "Free license granted to Reyes Modular Build as long as Naomi Reyes remains head of operations." It was just an online form and a small filing fee, but it gave me something priceless, a sense of ownership over my own work. I didn't see it as rebellion. I saw it as protection. As the project entered its final stretch, my life became a blur of blueprints and spreadsheets. Some weeks, I worked 14-hour days, sleeping only a few hours in the site cabin. Outside, Madison continued her parade, press conferences, interviews, even being invited to give a talk titled "The Role of Women in Modern Construction." My father watched her proudly, his face glowing on the live stream. I stood behind the screen, listening to her say, "We developed our proprietary modular technology." And I smiled faintly. We. That word had never sounded so distant. One late night, Glenn stopped by the construction site. He found me crouched under the harsh glow of a halogen lamp, a measuring tape in one hand and my phone in the other. "Naomi," he said, his voice calm but deliberate. "You know, in my 20 years in this business, very few people have done what you did today. Not because you're a woman, but because you think like an architect and act like an engineer." I looked up, startled. It continued. "Keep doing things your way. The others will have no choice but to follow." His words settled into me like warmth spreading through cold metal. For the first time, it felt like someone had finally heard the quiet sound I'd been making all these years. When Summit One finally opened, the red ribbon stretched across the entrance, the crowd dressed in crisp suits and bright smiles. Madison held the scissors, standing proudly between my father and Glenn, radiant under the camera flashes. I stood a few meters away, hard hat on, safety vest zipped, watching the tower rise against the sky. As the ribbon was cut and applause thundered across the courtyard, I didn't move closer. Instead, I slipped my hand into my pocket and felt the small steel keychain I'd kept since the first day I ever held a hammer. In that moment, I realized I had built something truly solid, even if it might never carry my name. After Summit One, my life took on a completely different rhythm. That project became the golden ticket that propelled Reyes Modular Build from a modest local firm into a name recognized across the entire Rocky Mountain region. Journalists called. Small contractors reached out for partnerships. New clients sent bidding invitations almost every week. In everyone's eyes, RMB had gone régional, number one régional, and my father was celebrated as the man who had steered the ship there. I still remember the first feature in the Denver Business Journal. A glossy photo of my father shaking hands with Glenn Whitaker, Madison beside them, her hair catching the sunlight, smiling like the face of the future. I was in that frame, two just farther back, half-turned, checking a column as dust blurred the background around me. The caption read, Naomi Reyes, technical head of the construction team. My name appeared only once. And, just like that, it vanished into the footnotes of our family's success story. I didn't blame anyone. Maybe because I'd never cared for camera flashes, I'd always believed that a building could speak for itself. But that quiet faith, over time, became a kind of restraint, one that slowly tightened around my own voice until I could barely hear it anymore. After Summit One, my father officially handed Madison the title of Head of Brand Development. It sounded impressive, almost presidential. But what it really meant was that everything public-facing clients, media, partnerships, new contracts now ran through her hands. As for me, I was given my familiar assignment. All technical operations, safety, and site management, that's yours. Back then, the RMB office buzzed like a giant beehive. Madison would stride out of conference rooms in pastel blazers, latte in hand, radiating confidence. I'd emerge from the workshop with rolled-up blueprints, hands stained with paint and cement dust. Every cost estimate, safety plan, and modular assembly method, I handled all of it. There were nights when every light on the street outside had gone dark, except one, the glow from my monitor. I'd still be there, checking every number, every dimension, terrified of even a 1% miscalculation. Eventually, I started sleeping in the office. Eating canned food. Skipping Christmas. Forgetting my own birthday. When friends texted to invite me out, I'd always reply with the same line. The project's not done yet. I intrigued. When Summit won Commercial Project of the Year, Madison went on stage to accept the award. Under the bright lights, she spoke about RMB's innovative vision and the leadership of the Reyes family. I stood at the very back of the hall, among the engineers and construction workers, confetti drifting around us like snow. When the applause peaked, my father grabbed Madison's hand and raised it high. It should have been a proud moment, it really should have, but all I felt was an emptiness I couldn't name. I didn't crave fame. I just wanted acknowledgement. Just once, to hear my father say, "Without you, Summit One wouldn't have been possible." But he didn't. He simply placed a hand on my shoulder and smiled. "You did great. Now help Madison with the next project, all right?" I began to realize that this company wasn't built only from steel and concrete. It was also built from something invisible: favoritism. Madison was always the visionary, while I was the one who made sure things didn't fall apart. In my father's eyes, a building standing firm was expected, but landing a new contract was what counted as an achievement. He often said, "Clients like the way Madison talks, she makes them feel confident." I'd smile, but inside, I'd think, they have no idea who actually keeps them safe. One late night, when the office was quiet except for the hum of the photocopier, I printed the technical proposal for our next project, North Creek Towers. I knocked on my father's door and handed him the document. He glanced at his watch and frowned. "You're still here?" "I wanted to present an upgrade for the I-beam process," I said. "If we apply it to the entire Block B structure, we can cut steel costs by around 12%. He listened halfway, then waved his hand dismissively. Good. Just leave it there. We'll discuss it tomorrow in the meeting. Let Madison prepare the slides." He hesitated. "Anyone can make slides," I said quietly. "But these calculations, maybe you could look them over for a minute?" He looked up, irritation flashing across his face. "Naomi, you need to learn to trust other people. Stop trying to control everything." I stepped back and forced a smile. "Yes, sir." "Oh." But as I walked out, I felt like I had just dropped a small piece of myself somewhere behind that door. The following months, I became a gear spinning endlessly in the machine. I was managing 4 projects at once: Aspen Care Clinic, North Creek Towers, and 2 residential developments in Fort Collins. I kept telling myself this was the company's golden age, and if I just held on a little longer, my father would finally see me. Whenever something went wrong, a delay, a supplier issue, a safety concern, my phone rang. Didn't matter if it was midnight or a Sunday, everyone assumed I'd fix it. I became that person, the one people counted on but rarely credited. Every time a project finished on schedule, Madison would post on social media, "Our team did it again." Every time I read that word, a heavy fog pressed against my chest. When the company's profits began to rise, I finally gathered the courage to speak up. "Dad, I think I should have some shares or at least a bonus tied to the company's growth. If I were just a regular employee, I'd already have one. But I've been here since the beginning. I just want to feel like I truly belong." He looked up from his desk, his voice calm but sharp. "Naomi, family doesn't measure things that way. Everything I have will belong to my children one day." I went silent. He said, "My children, not you." I swallowed what I wanted to say and just nodded. That night, I stayed late in the office, alone. Through the glass wall, I could see the construction site still glowing under the sodium lights. A few workers were cleaning up, their sweat glistening like molten metal. I remembered something my father once said. "People don't remember who poured the concrete, they only remember who cuts the ribbon." Maybe he was right. But then a thought crossed my mind. If one day no one pours the concrete, what would they have left to cut? I turned off the lights and headed out. In my jacket pocket, my old steel keychain brushed against my phone, making a faint metallic sound like a quiet reminder from the universe not to forget why I started. Outside, I paused by the empty parking lot and looked up at the Summit One tower, glowing against the night sky. A strange mix of pride and loneliness welled up inside me. I still believed one day my father would understand. But I didn't know then that this very faith would cost me years spent living in someone else's shadow. I turned 25 that spring, just as the company signed a massive new contract with Aspen Care, a fast-growing private hospital chain expanding across the region. It was an 8-figure deal, our second largest after Summit One, and the entire office buzzed like we'd just won the lottery. Madison was everywhere, calling reporters, arranging interviews, hosting a grand kickoff meeting in the building's main lobby. I sat quietly in the back, laptop open, reviewing the design file the client had just sent over. When I reached the bottom of the document, my pulse stopped for a beat. In the corner, it read, "Completion date, 9 months." A project of this scale needed at least 14 months unless you wanted to gamble with structural quality. I leaned toward Madison. "Who set this timeline?" She smiled. "Don't worry. They want to open before Thanksgiving, so I locked that in. We can make it work." I gripped the stack of papers tighter. "Did you check with the engineering team? Did anyone even calculate the steel load or the modular sequence yet?" She laughed softly, waving her hand. "Naomi, you worry too much. Just trust the team. You're RMB's best engineer, aren't you?" I didn't answer. Because for the first time, I wasn't sure if being the best engineer in the company meant anything. When the people running it refused to listen. That night, I stayed in the office until midnight, every spreadsheet open across my screen. The results were simple and merciless. If we stuck to a 9-month schedule, we'd need to run 3 continuous shifts, operating day and night. Costs would spike by 22%, and the risk of accidents would double. The next morning, I brought the report to my father. He skimmed through the pages, then folded them neatly and said, "Madison says the client's thrilled. This is a golden opportunity for us to expand. I trust you'll make it work." I pushed back gently. "I can make it work, but the risks are high. If we fall behind, we'll lose credibility." He placed a hand on my shoulder, his voice firm and reassuring. "I trust you." That sentence meant as praise felt instead like a sentence of responsibility. Because what he really meant was, "You'll carry it if it collapses." The months that followed blurred into one long stretch of exhaustion between job sites and the office. I practically lived out of the technical truck, driving back and forth between Denver and Colorado Springs. Some nights I fell asleep right on top of blueprints, waking up at 4 a.m. with my wrist locked from cramping. Madison still showed up at every client meeting, perfectly composed. Every time we crossed paths, she'd flash that effortless smile and say, "You holding up okay? Stay positive, they love us." I didn't have the strength to argue anymore. All I wanted was for the structure not to collapse literally or figuratively. By the 8th month, things started breaking down for real. One shipment of modular units arrived late. Summer storms delayed the concrete cure. I had to pull weekend shifts, sometimes sleeping on site. There was one night I slipped off the scaffolding, scraped my arm, and still climbed back up because the project was already 3 days behind. In the end, somehow, we finished a full week ahead of schedule. The ribbon-cutting ceremony was grand. Clients clapped. Madison gave the keynote speech. My father hugged her in front of the crowd and told a reporter, "This one's got real leadership in her blood." Ho! I stood a few yards away, still in my work boots, dust from the site clinging to my sleeves. Applause echoed all around. No one asked how many nights I'd slept there to keep the building from falling. That night at dinner, my mother said casually over the clinking of plates, "Sweetheart, don't compete with your sister so much. Madison's the future CEO. You're great at operations, that's more than enough. Every family needs someone to hold the foundation. If everyone tried to lead, it'd be chaos." I set my spoon down and looked at her. "Mom, have you ever thought about what happens if the one holding the foundation decides to leave?" She smiled, soft and certain. "Don't be silly. Family is forever. No one leaves." I didn't reply. Because in that moment, I finally understood. To them, I wasn't a daughter. I was a support beam. And support beams aren't supposed to move. From that point on, I went to work like a machine. I no longer felt like an engineer, more like a highly skilled laborer. Smart enough to carry the responsibility, but never visionary enough to make the decisions. Madison gradually became the face in every strategic meeting. I was only called in afterward, once the talking was done and the problems needed solving. Once, during a client meeting, someone asked directly, "Naomi, who approved this design?" I answered honestly, "I drew it." Madison approved it. The room chuckled politely. I lowered my eyes and said nothing. Sleepless nights became my routine. I worked out of fear that something might collapse, that the company's reputation would crumble because I failed to hold it together. But then another thought began to form, quietly at first. What would happen if I stopped? If I didn't show up tomorrow, who would fill the gap? That question lingered. It grew heavier each day every time I saw my father praising Madison in front of the team, or my mother proudly showing off a magazine cover with her photo. I realized something painful. Maybe none of them actually knew what I did. They just knew that I made everything work. One evening, I sat in my car outside the house, blueprints still in my lap. Through the window, I could see the warm light of the living room, my father and Madison talking, their laughter spilling through the glass. I suddenly felt like an outsider. Not a daughter, just an employee who'd been allowed to share dinner with the boss's family. I thought back to the old construction worker who once told me, "If you keep that spirit, every structure you build will stand strong." Back then, I believed him. But now I understood no structure can stay standing if the person holding it up no longer wants to. After years of non-stop work and night classes, I finally earned my part-time MBA. I didn't study business because I wanted to change careers. I studied it because I wanted to understand how companies really worked. The kind of knowledge my father always claimed belonged only to people who knew how to talk to others. I thought, maybe one day, he'd finally see that I could lead a company, not just build one. That evening, my parents hosted what they called a graduation celebration dinner at an upscale restaurant in Cherry Creek. When I walked in, the room glowed with warm golden light. White roses lined the tables, and behind them hung a huge banner embossed with the logo. RMB, Reyes Modular Build. It felt less like a family gathering and more like a corporate event. Madison stood near the center of the room, wearing a deep red dress that made her look as if she'd just stepped off the cover of a magazine. She was laughing with a group of longtime clients, the kind who always called my father Bob. He stood nearby, wine glass in hand, beaming with the kind of joy he reserved for nights when he had big news to share. I arrived late straight from the Aspen Care site, still unfinished. I hadn't even taken a seat when my father tapped his glass. The chatter died instantly. "Tonight," he began, voice full of pride, "we're not just celebrating my youngest daughter's MBA. We're also here for another special reason, something I've been keeping quiet for a while." A quiet unease crept up my spine. I glanced around. Madison smiled, her hands folded neatly in front of her, like someone who already knew what came next. My father lifted his chin, his voice cutting through the background music. "As of today, I'm officially passing the CEO position of Reyes Modular Build to Madison Reyes." Applause filled the room. Glasses clinked. The sound of celebration swelled like a tide. Madison burst into tears, throwing her arms around him. My mother rose from her seat, placed a hand on Madison's shoulder, and said proudly, "She's always had vision, and Naomi, you're the company's technical heart. But every business needs a face." I sat still, my fingers clenched so tightly my knuckles turned white. I didn't look at anyone. In that moment, the last 7 years flashed before me like an old film reel, the nights I spent on job sites, the injuries, the sleepless hours, the deadlines I saved. And it all ended with one soft sentence. "The company needs a face." I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I simply took a slow breath, reached into my bag, and pulled out my small steel keychain, the same piece of metal I'd kept since my first project. I placed it gently on the table beside my half-finished glass of wine. No one noticed. Only the light caught it, a brief flash across the metal before fading away. For me, that wasn't an act of anger. It was a quiet declaration, a way of telling myself, enough. I had carried them long enough. And that night, I finally set the weight down. Then Madison took the microphone, her voice trembling just enough to sound sincere. "Naomi, you've always been my inspiration. You're the reason this company is as strong as it is today. And you know what? I'll always need you by my side as my partner." The room broke into applause again. I smiled politely, but inside, only one thought echoed. "You don't need me beside you. You need me behind you." All my life, I had stood behind them, supporting, stabilizing, fixing while they handed the titles and recognition to someone else, as if fairness were a gift they could give or withhold on a whim. When the dinner ended and people began to drift away, I stayed seated, watching ribbons and confetti scatter across the floor. Then my phone buzzed. It was a message from Glenn Whitaker, CEO of Carrington Urban Partners, our biggest client. "Congrats, Naomi. Proud of you." I stared at those words for a long time. Maybe Glenn had assumed I was the one being promoted that night, that I would finally be recognized as the new leader of Reyes Modular Build. He couldn't have known that at that very same dinner, I'd been quietly written out of the story I'd spent my youth building. Still, I smiled. Because at least one person out there understood that the word "you" in that message truly meant me, not Madison. Driving home, snow began to fall, soft, steady flakes dusting the slopes around Sloan's Lake. I pulled over, watching the snow melt slowly against the windshield, the world hushed and still. I thought about my father, a man who believed being right was the same as being good. About my mother, who feared losing face more than losing her child. And about Madison, who now had everything I no longer felt the need to fight for. In my mind, my father's old words returned. People only remember who cuts the ribbon. Maybe that would always be true. But maybe one day, when the structure tilts even slightly, they'll finally notice who kept it standing. I don't know what my future will look like. All I know is that when I left that steel keychain on the table that night, I stopped belonging to Rhea's modular build. When I got home, I took off my coat and sat on the cold floor. My phone still glowed with Glenn's message. I typed back a short reply. "Thank you, Glenn. I really needed that." Then I turned the phone off and lowered my head onto my knees. Not because I was broken, but because, for the first time in years, I felt light. For the first time, I had stopped trying to be seen, and started learning how to see myself. After that so-called graduation celebration dinner, something in me quietly shifted. There was no outburst, no argument, no dramatic resignation. Just calm. The next morning, when I arrived at the Rhea's modular build office, I turned on my computer at exactly 8 o'clock and turned it off at 5. From that day on, I worked like an ordinary employee. Nothing more, nothing less. No overtime. No late-night emergency calls. No quiet heroics to fix mistakes I no longer had the authority to correct. If a plan came in with the wrong specs, I highlighted the section and sent a properly worded email. If the schedule slipped, I logged the cause in the project report. Everything I did was precise, documented, and traceable, like someone quietly organizing their own exit. At first, no one noticed. Madison was too busy adjusting to her new title. My father was busy entertaining clients. And I still showed up, still signed documents, still reviewed technical files. It all looked stable until the cracks began to appear. A residential project in Boulder ran late because the materials were delivered out of spec. A site supervision team sent an incorrect sequencing report, halting an entire assembly line. Normally, I would have jumped in, immediately found the cause, recalculated the loads, rebuilt the schedule. But this time, I didn't. I just sent a short email to the site manager. Error caused by incorrect input data. Please review and adjust accordingly. And XD Madison. That was it. 3 days later, she called me mid-morning. "Naomi, why aren't you in Boulder? They need technical oversight." I replied evenly. "You're the CEO. You can assign whoever you see fit. I'm responsible for supervision, not crisis response." She paused for a moment. "I thought you wanted everything to be perfect." "No," I said, "I just want everything to follow protocol." There was an awkward laugh on the other end. You always so rigid." I hung up, opened my Excel sheet, and went back to work. For the first time in my life, I felt peace, the kind that comes from not overperforming. 2 weeks later, the chain of small mistakes began stacking up. Wrong material orders. A junior engineer forgot to update a design revision. Blueprints sent out under the wrong version. Each error was small, but together, they piled up like misaligned bricks, and soon, the whole structure started to tilt. I didn't feel smug. Just relieved. Because finally, everyone could see what I had been saying all along. This system didn't run on its own. It ran on the backs of people who worked past midnight, whose names never made it into the reports. During that time, I spent my evenings quietly rewriting the entire I-beam sequencing process step by step, condition by condition, every single technical checkpoint documented with care. I saved it all in a private folder and titled it, "For the Next Person." I wasn't sure when I would leave, but I knew that day would come. And when it did, I didn't want anyone, even the one who replaced me, to start from chaos. Maybe that was the engineer in me, or maybe the daughter who still believed in professional duty, even toward a company that no longer spoke my name. One afternoon, Madison stopped by the technical office. She carried 2 cups of coffee and placed one in front of me. "Dinner tonight?" she asked softly. "It's been a while since we really talked." I looked at the cup, then said quietly, "I'm in the middle of something." She sat down across from me, voice gentle. "I know the dinner that night caught you off guard, but you have to understand Dad was just thinking about the company. I need you behind me like always. We've always been the perfect team, haven't we?" I raised my head and met her eyes. "If you need me behind you, then you should also learn to stand in front of the mistakes." The words came out softly, almost like an exhale, but they filled the room with a heavy stillness. Madison's lips pressed together. I saw a flicker of hurt in her eyes before she masked it with a fragile smile. "You've changed," she said quietly. I shrugged. "Maybe I've just found my real position again." After that, the office air felt different, colder somehow. People who once called me at midnight began to hesitate. They didn't know what to ask anymore, because every time a problem arose, I answered with the same calm sentence. "Noted. Please follow proper procedure." Oh? Even my father started to notice. One morning, he walked into my office. "Why aren't you as passionate as before?" "I'm still doing my job," I replied. He frowned. "Doing your job isn't enough. This family survives by depending on each other." I looked him straight in the eye. "Family or company, Dad?" He opened his mouth to respond, but then only sighed, shook his head, and walked away. The fracture spread quickly like a crack running through unset concrete. Whispers began circulating. "Naomi's drifting away from the company." Madison tried to keep up appearances, posting cheerful updates online. "Rhea's modular build expanding our vision once again." But, inside, the truth was unraveling. Project timelines slipped. Technical errors multiplied. Costs rose week after week. I didn't celebrate any of it. I just recorded everything neatly, quietly, methodically. Because I knew the truth engineers never say out loud. For a structure to collapse, you don't need a storm. You just need the person holding it up to finally stop. That winter, I filed for 10 days of vacation, my first in 6 years. I left Denver and drove up to the mountains of Estes Park, along the winding road that led to Bear Lake. I brought my laptop with me, but I never opened it. I just sat by the water, watching the rocks catch the last gold of the afternoon, listening to the quiet rhythm of the waves brushing against the shore. I thought about my father. About Madison. About my mother, who still believed everything that happened in our family was out of love. I knew they would never change. But I would. Because I could no longer keep building a house whose foundation was injustice. When I returned to Denver, I walked into the office with a calm I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't angry anymore. I just knew one thing: I was ready for the day I'd leave. And this time, no one else would tell my story for me. That morning, the sky over Denver was gray and heavy, wind sweeping across the glass towers and leaving trails of condensation behind. I walked into the 14th floor conference room of Carrington Urban Partners, the biggest client Rhea's modular build had ever worked with, the company I had personally helped grow through years of sweat and sacrifice. The meeting was for the expansion of Aspen Care Phase 2. Representing Rhea's modular build were my father, Madison, and me. At the head of the table sat Glenn Whitaker, Carrington's CEO, calm as ever, his eyes sharp beneath the soft light. But his first words carried a chill that cut through the room. "Before we begin," Glenn said, tapping his fingers lightly on the folder before him, "I'd like to make one thing clear. Without Naomi, Carrington will not be renewing its contract with Rhea's modular build." The room went silent. Madison shifted slightly, the practiced smile on her face draining of color. My father, rarely caught off guard, froze for a few seconds before composing himself. "I think there's been a misunderstanding, Glenn," he began, his tone steady. "Naomi is, of course, still part of our team." Glenn cut him off. No misunderstanding, Robert. We partnered with RMB because of the I-beam modular sequencing system, and the person who created it is Naomi. I know that for a fact. Without her oversight, I can't guarantee the safety or quality of Phase 2. Then he turned toward me, his gaze sharp but respectful. Naomi, that system belongs to you, doesn't it? I took a slow breath and answered carefully. Yes. That process belongs to my own company I-beam Methods LLC. Reyes Modular Build only has free licensing rights under an internal agreement, valid as long as I hold the position of head of operations. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw my father turn toward me, his face a mixture of surprise and quiet anger, like he just uncovered something he never imagined could exist. I didn't look away. I spoke clearly, word by word. That clause was filed and registered with the state of Colorado 2 years ago. I've simply followed the law. Madison swallowed hard, her voice trembling. Naomi, what are you talking about? This is a family company. I turned to her, calm and steady. Exactly. And that's the only reason I never charged royalties for the process all this time. Glenn watched the exchange silently, then leaned back in his chair and smiled faintly. I have to say, Naomi, that's incredibly professional. Carrington needs people who understand the value of their own work. He paused briefly, then continued, his tone deliberate. I'd like to formally offer you a position at Carrington Director of Operations for our entire healthcare infrastructure division. You'd have full authority to oversee and innovate across our projects, including implementation of the I-beam system, if you're willing. The room went still. I heard Madison inhale sharply. My father sat motionless, his eyes moving from Glenn to me, stunned, wounded, uncertain. I met Glenn's gaze and answered softly. Thank you, sincerely. But I'm not ready to make a decision yet. I'm still learning where my boundaries begin and end. Glenn nodded respectfully. Fair enough, Carrington's doors are always open. When you're ready, just call. The meeting ended in heavy silence. Madison forced a smile as she shook Glenn's hand, but I could see the tremor in her fingers. As we left the building, my father walked ahead, his stride brisk, almost angry as if trying to outrun the moment. I followed quietly. At the parking lot, he finally stopped and turned toward me. Cold air swept through, carrying the smell of snow and exhaust sharp and metallic. Since when do you negotiate with clients like that? He asked, his voice low and rough. Since the day I realized I had to protect the work I built, I replied. Without that system, RMB would never have won the Carrington bid. He stared at me, something flickering between frustration and helplessness. You're pushing this family away, Naomi. I shook my head slowly. No, Dad. This family pushed me away first. I'm just standing still. My words left him silent. He turned, opened the car door, but paused, his hand tightening around the handle. You think you've won? He said quietly. No one wins when a family breaks apart. Then he got in, started the engine, and drove away. I stood there in the empty parking lot, watching the taillights disappear into the dark. I don't know if he realized it, but that was the moment the real fracture began. Not in contracts or technical systems, but in the fragile bond of trust between a father and his daughter. The very thing I had spent years trying to preserve had finally split in two. That night, I went back to my apartment and opened my laptop. In my inbox was an email from Glenn Whitaker. Naomi, proposal attached. Take your time, you've earned it. I read through every line carefully. The terms were clear, fair, transparent, things I had never once seen at RMB. I didn't reply. Instead, I opened the file I had been writing for months. For the next person. I reread every instruction, every technical note, every small detail that once held the company together. Then, at the very end, I added one final line, short, simple, and absolute. No structure is truly stable if its foundation is built on silence. I saved the file and renamed it. Transition, RMB, Final. I knew that the next morning, when I walked into the office, my father would never look at me the same way again. But that was all right. Because at that exact moment, he would also begin to understand, no matter how tall a building stands, it cannot last when the person holding it up has decided to let go. 3 months after that meeting with Carrington, Reyes Modular Build's revenue began to plummet. I wasn't surprised. When leadership starts making decisions out of pride instead of data, collapse is only a matter of time. In her desperate attempt to prove herself, Madison signed a reckless deal with Westmore Group, a developer planning a new chain of shopping complexes in Salt Lake City. The contract demanded completion in 8 months, something I knew was impossible, especially for a team already stretched thin. But Madison needed a win to salvage her crumbling image. And my father, blinded by loyalty and denial, convinced himself that hard work always finds a way. I continued to work as usual, on time, precise, responsible. But each passing day, the air inside the company grew heavier, like concrete setting too fast. By the second month, the financial report told the truth. Operating costs up 18%, revenue down 22%. The best engineers started quitting. And our longtime clients, even Carrington, began reaching out to me directly through my personal email, bypassing RMB entirely. Madison was furious. She accused me of undermining the company's reputation. I simply replied, "I'm not stopping them from contacting the person they trust." Then, in the 3rd month, disaster struck. Westmore Group publicly accused Reyes Modular Build of project delays, substandard materials, and significant financial losses. The headlines hit like a storm. Madison tried to control the narrative, holding a press conference, forcing smiles through flashing cameras, but the questions from the media came like relentless waves. They asked about structural inconsistencies, safety protocol violations, and sequencing failures, every single issue I had warned about. On the local news broadcast that night, I watched Madison sitting beside my father, both framed under a giant banner that read, "Integrity in every structure." I turned off the TV. The word integrity had never looked more ironic. 2 days later, my mother called. Her voice was so soft, I almost didn't recognize it. "Naomi, could you come home for dinner tonight? Your father. He wants to talk." I agreed. Not out of curiosity, but because somewhere deep down, I still wanted to hear what they had left to say. Dinner was at our old house in Lakewood, the same house that had barely changed since I was in college. The family photos still lined the staircase. The porcelain vase my mother bought years ago sat on the same corner shelf. And the old wooden dining table where I used to do my homework gleamed under the yellow light. The smell of food filled the air, rich and familiar, but the atmosphere was thick and heavy, like the walls themselves could sense something was about to end. My father sat at the head of the table. His face was tired, the gray in his hair more pronounced. Madison sat silently, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. He spoke first, his voice hoarse and slow. "Naomi, I know there have been misunderstandings between us. The company is going through a difficult time, and I want to do what's right for both of you." He paused, glanced at my mother, then continued. "I've decided to propose that you and Madison become co-CEOs with a 60-40 split. Madison will oversee external relations and business. You'll manage operations and engineering. This way, things stay balanced. The family comes together again, and the company can stand strong." I looked around the table. The reflection of the chandelier shimmered in the wine glasses, making the air feel fragile, like one wrong word could shatter it all. My mother gave a small, hopeful smile. "Sweetheart, sometimes it takes one person to speak and another to build. You two complete each other. Your father and I just want to see you lead together." 1. Madison's voice broke slightly as she added, "I know I've made mistakes. But right now, the company really needs you. Please, Naomi." I stayed silent for a long while. Maybe, in another time, I would have softened. But now, after seeing everything for what it truly was, all I felt was sadness, the quiet kind that comes from understanding too late. I set my wine glass down and spoke calmly. "If Madison and I are both CEOs, then who holds legal responsibility if there's a site accident? or if there's a contract breach. The question froze the table. My father avoided my eyes. Madison bit her lip. My mother sighed softly. No one answered. I nodded slowly. Then this isn't about sharing leadership. It's about sharing risk. When things go well, Madison is the face. When things go wrong, I'm the liability. I paused, looking directly at my father. What I need isn't a title handed out when everything is falling apart. What I need is recognition for what I've built while it's still standing. Silence filled the room again. The faint clink of a knife against a plate echoed, then stopped. Finally, I set my napkin on the table and stood. Thank you for dinner, I said quietly. But I think it's too late to talk about unity. My father rose halfway from his chair, voice rising with frustration. Naomi, you can't walk away while the family is in crisis. I turned back to him and smiled, small but firm. I'm not walking away, Dad. I'm just stopping the part where I carry everyone else. The next morning, I arrived at the office earlier than usual. I opened my laptop and typed my resignation letter. Transition period, 3 weeks. All technical files, operational procedures, and project records will be handed over in full before departure. I printed it, signed my name, and placed the letter on the receptionist's desk with a note. For Robert Reyes. As I stepped out of the building, the first light of morning spilled across the parking lot sharp, clean, and golden. I took a deep breath, and for the first time in years, my chest didn't feel heavy. For the first time, I wasn't wondering whether they'd ever recognize my worth. Because I had stopped waiting for that moment. I no longer sought validation in anyone's eyes, only in my own decision to finally let go. Behind me, the Reyes modular build sign caught the morning sun polished steel letters glinting bright and cold. Beautiful, but lifeless. I knew that the next time I passed by, it might not even be standing there anymore. But that didn't matter. Because what I had built from the beginning was never just a company. It was skill, discipline, and self-respect. And those are things no one can take away. I drove downtown to the new headquarters of Carrington Urban Partners, a sleek glass tower I used to visit only as a subcontractor. Today, I walked in with an entirely different identity. On my desk already sat a contract thick, organized, and transparent down to every clause. At the top, in clean bold letters, Vice President of Operations, Carrington Urban Partners. Below that were terms I'd never seen in a decade at my father's company. Performance-based profit sharing, a 3-year RSU vesting schedule, and most striking of all, an official exclusive license for the I-beam modular sequencing system, granted by me, its rightful owner, to Carrington. Moments later, Glenn Whitaker walked in. His smile was warm, but his eyes sharp, calculating, still carried the steel of a man who had spent his life navigating boardrooms. Welcome to Carrington, Naomi, he said, taking a seat across from me. Then he tapped the desk lightly. Let me tell you something I want you to remember. Recognition isn't charity, it's good business. I smiled, the tightness in my throat slowly easing. Thank you, Glenn. I've waited a long time to work somewhere where value doesn't have to beg for acknowledgement. He laughed softly. And Carrington's been waiting even longer for someone like you. The first 3 months passed like a fresh breeze. For the first time in years, I felt the energy of creation again, not survival. I was given full autonomy to build my own engineering division. 15 people, most of them young engineers I personally recruited from local universities. Among them was Maya, a 4-year-old from Seattle, bright, curious, and fearless. She had that spark in her eyes, the kind that always came with questions starting with, "Why do we do it this way?" I liked that. In her, I saw a reflection of myself 10 years ago, when I still believed that asking why was the first step to building something worth standing on. We began rebuilding Carrington's entire operational model, from material selection and scheduling to the way we managed on-site crews. For the first time in my career, I didn't have to ask for permission on every small decision. Glenn's only instruction was simple. Just do it and show me the results. And the results came faster than even he expected. The first 3 projects my team led all exceeded their profit targets, cut material costs by 17%, and shortened construction timelines by an average of 11 days. A week later, Glenn sent me an email with a single line. "Told you it's good business." Sometimes, when everyone had gone home, I would stay late in my office, a corner space wrapped in glass on 3 sides, overlooking the Denver skyline. On the shelf behind me hung the small steel keychain, the same piece of metal I'd kept from that first project years ago in Lakewood. When the sunset poured through the window, it glimmered like a quiet beacon, reminding me that sometimes the most enduring structures aren't the ones you build, but the strength you build within yourself. For the first time in 7 years, I felt what freedom truly meant. I didn't have to explain why I worked late. I didn't have to ask for permission to innovate. And most of all, I was no longer bound by the name Reyes. I started living again. Morning yoga. Weekend hikes through Estes Park. Occasional visits to Carrington sites just to breathe in that familiar scent of freshly poured concrete, the smell of something new being built, solid, honest, and needing no applause. Sometimes, Maya would glance up from her workstation and ask, "Do you ever regret leaving your family's company?" I'd look out the window, smile faintly, and say, "No, because if I hadn't left, I never would have truly begun." While I was leading Carrington's new projects, the headlines about RMB began flooding industry news feeds. Reyes Modular Build loses 3 consecutive bids. Wells Capital terminates RMB's credit line. Westmore Group cancels contract, seeks damages. How? Each article felt like a fragment of the truth I'd seen coming years ago. Madison tried to maintain the illusion, posting online updates that read, "We're restructuring to come back stronger." But everyone in the industry knew what that really meant. When a bank freezes your credit line, it doesn't mean you're rebuilding. It means no one believes you'll ever be able to repay. One late afternoon in June, I received an email from an old RMB engineer. "Naomi, you once said that if the foundation isn't solid, the whole structure will collapse. I understand that now. Congratulations, you're finally where you belong." I read that line over and over, a quiet ache rising in my chest, not from joy, but from release. I didn't feel triumphant over their downfall. What I felt was justice, the kind that doesn't need a courtroom, only time to prove it right. That evening, Glenn invited me to dinner with Carrington's board of directors. He raised his glass and introduced me. "This is the woman who changed the way we build. An engineer, a leader, and above all someone who knows her worth." As he spoke, I looked around the table. The warm light glowed against the crystal glasses, laughter filled the room, and for the first time, I felt something simple yet powerful settle inside me, belonging without sacrifice. I didn't need to shrink myself to fit anymore. When I returned to my office that night, the city shimmered beyond the glass walls. The small steel keychain on my shelf caught the light, glowing faintly. I touched it gently, and Glenn's words from my first day echoed back. "Recognition isn't charity, it's good business." He was right. But I had also learned something he hadn't said aloud. Sometimes, to be recognized, you have to walk away from the place that refused to see you, not out of revenge, but to be reborn. And like that small piece of steel, I realized I was no longer confined by the name Reyes. I had become something sturdier. Someone who builds structures that stand not only on ground, but on dignity. The news arrived on a Monday morning in mid-March. I was in a project meeting for Aspen Care Phase 2 when the display screen behind us flickered with a breaking headline from the Denver Business Journal. Reyes Modular Build loses $18 million contract with Westmore Development following multiple delays and critical structural failures. My pen froze mid-note. The room fell silent for a few seconds until someone murmured, "Reyes, wasn't that the company you used to work for, Naomi?" I nodded softly. "It was. Once." "Oh." From the head of the table, Glenn glanced toward me. He didn't say a word, but his eyes said everything, understanding, not pity. Then he cleared his throat and calmly moved on to the next agenda item. But all morning, I couldn't focus. The memories replayed in fragments. Madison's radiant smile under the camera flashes, my father's proud hand holding hers on stage, my mother's glowing face in the background. And that gleaming steel sign. Rhea's modular build, shining like a promise the day I walked away. Now, somewhere in the heart of Denver, I imagined it beginning to rust. That afternoon, just as I was leaving the office, my phone rang. On the screen appeared a name I hadn't seen in years, Grace, the old receptionist at RMB, who had manned the front desk for over a decade. I answered, and her voice trembled raw, uneven, the sound of someone who'd been crying. Naomi? It's me, Grace. I'm so sorry to bother you, but things are really bad here. The company's falling apart. Westmore's pulled all their funding. Madison isn't talking to the press, and the bank froze our credit line. People are terrified, Naomi. There are 45 families depending on RMB for their paychecks. I don't know who else to call. I leaned back in my chair, staring out the window where the late sunlight painted the rooftops gold. Inside me, there was no anger, just a strange, hollow stillness. Grace, I said quietly, I understand, but I'm not there anymore. On the other end, she went silent for a moment, then spoke again, her voice breaking. I know, I just thought you'd want to know. Because you always cared about us, really cared. And then she hung up. I sat there for a long time, unmoving. On the desk beside me, the last light of day caught the old steel keychain, the one piece I had carried from RMB, and cast a thin reflection across the wall, like a fragile thread connecting two worlds. The past and the present. I thought of something Glenn had said to me during my first week at Carrington. Family is complicated. He was right. Family isn't complicated because we hate them. It's complicated because, once, we loved them too much. That evening, I had just poured myself a cup of tea when the phone buzzed again. This time, the screen showed Madison. I stared at her name glowing on the display, hesitating for a few seconds before answering. Heavy breathing came through first, then her voice, low and strained with exhaustion. Naomi, it's me. I said nothing. She swallowed hard before continuing, her voice cracking. Dad's in the hospital. The doctors said he's severely exhausted, his heart's weak. He's been running himself ragged these past few weeks trying to save the company. He doesn't sleep. He barely eats. Mom's falling apart too. Can you come? I gripped the phone tighter, a sudden current running through my body. The room fell into an uncanny stillness. Even the whistle of the kettle on the stove sounded distant, like it belonged to another world. I asked quietly, Are you calling me because of the company, or because of Dad? Madison hesitated. Her voice cracked when she finally spoke. You know how things are, everything's collapsing. But Dad still asks about you every day. He keeps thinking you'll come back. I closed my eyes and drew a deep breath. I'm not coming back, Madison. On the other end, I heard soft sobs, faint, uneven blending into the sound of her shallow breathing. You don't have to come back, she whispered. Just, come see him. He won't say it, but I know he misses you. When the call ended, I sat motionless, the phone still warm in my hand. Outside, the first flakes of snow began to fall, tapping gently against the glass before melting into thin trails of water. I watched them slide down the window, dissolving slowly the same way I felt something inside me beginning to melt, too. My mind drifted back to the early days when I was just a young engineer standing in the cold shadow of unfinished steel beams, full of hope and belief. I remembered the sleepless nights spent making sure every deadline was met, every beam aligned. And I remembered my father's voice. You're good, but this company needs someone with more vision. Maybe he never realized that those words were what pushed me to leave. To find a way to see myself through eyes other than his. Now, he was lying in a hospital bed, frail, exhausted. While I, his daughter, sat in an apartment filled with light, surrounded by everything he once wanted for me. Everything he never believed I could build on my own. I stood up, reached for my coat, and caught my reflection in the mirror by the door. The woman looking back at me no longer looked tired, or angry, only certain. I understood then. I would go. But not to rescue the Reyes legacy. And not to return to the place that once broke me. I would go to end the cycle. To close the loop that had bound me for nearly 10 years. I texted Glenn. I'm taking the day off. Family matter. His reply came almost instantly. Take your time. Some closures matter more than projects. That night, I drove through snow-covered streets toward Swedish Medical Center. The hospital lights glowed white like cold stars against the dark. When I parked, a gust of wind rattled the small steel keychain hanging from my rearview mirror, the one I'd carried since my very first job site. It clinked softly, a sound both distant and familiar. I reached for it, the metal worn and a little rusted, yet still strong, still whole. I smiled faintly, whispering under my breath. All right, Dad. I'm coming not to rebuild, but to finally let go. And then I stepped through the hospital doors, where the sterile white light met the quiet breath of memory, ready to face the final chapter of a structure I had spent years building, not out of steel, but out of silence. The hospital was hushed, almost reverent. Monitors beeped in slow, steady rhythm like the ticking of time itself. I stood outside the cardiac recovery room, the old keychain still clutched in my hand. When the nurse opened the door, the scent of antiseptic filled the air, sharp and clean under the morning lights. On the bed lay my father, once the unshakable symbol of our company, now just a fragile old man, thinner than I remembered, his eyes dim but still aware. When he saw me, his lips trembled into a faint, genuine smile. Naomi, you came. I nodded, pulling a chair close to his bedside. He was silent for a few seconds, then spoke again, voice rough, scraping like gravel. I was wrong. Not once, many times. You were the one who held that company together, not me, not Madison. I looked at him, and for the first time in years, there was no anger left. Only a deep, quiet compassion for his blindness, for the years we both lost, and for the version of him that never learned the difference between leadership and love. I don't need to hear that to live well, I said softly, but with finality. But thank you for having the courage to say it. Ah. His eyes grew wet. He turned his face away, trying to hide it, but his hands betrayed him, trembling as they clutched the edge of the blanket. I reached out and placed my hand over his, the same hand that once ruled boardrooms, that once slammed on desks when I spoke out of turn. Now, that hand trembled inside mine, small, frail, like a fading memory that still wanted to be held. After our brief conversation, I found Madison in the waiting room. She was sitting motionless, dark circles under her eyes, her posture sagging from nights without sleep. When she saw me, she stood up, forcing a tired smile. Her voice was hoarse, nearly breaking. Dad's going to have to step down for a while. You know, he always believed in you. I don't even know where to start anymore. I exhaled slowly. I'm not coming back, Madison. But if you really want to keep the company alive, I can help short-term. Our inframet. She looked up, a flicker of hope flashing through the exhaustion. Help? How? Carrington runs a 6-month technical mentorship program, I said. I can come in as an external consultant, not a director, not an employee. I'll help stabilize the operations, reorganize the systems, make sure the remaining staff keep their jobs. But it won't be free. Madison nodded so fast it almost looked like fear that I might change my mind. Deal. I'll let you handle it however you see fit. Luck. A few weeks later, a memorandum of understanding was signed between Carrington Urban Partners and Reyes Modular Build. Glenn personally approved the partnership. When he reviewed the file, he looked up at me and smiled. Sometimes, he said, saving what once hurt you is the only way to be completely free. I met his gaze and replied quietly. I'm not saving them, Glenn. I'm protecting the 45 innocent people who still depend on that paycheck. End of quote. He nodded, the respect in his eyes unmistakable, the kind of understanding that doesn't need more words. The day I returned to the Westmore Phase 2 site, the sky was heavy and gray, the wind carrying that old familiar scent of steel dust. Workers paused mid-task. A few recognized me, their faces lighting up in a mix of surprise and relief. I slipped on my old hard hat and stepped across the stained concrete. No one called me boss. They called me Engineer Naomi, and I realized I preferred that more than any title I'd ever had. I started with the simplest thing: reviewing the plans, identifying what was broken, redrawing the timeline, then standing in the open yard calling each foreman by name. Something strange happened, then the months of chaos seemed to quiet. Tired faces straightened, the air shifted, and for the first time in a long while, I could sense order and trust returning. I didn't give a speech. I didn't make promises. I only said, "I'm not here to command. I'm here to make sure everyone keeps their jobs and this project finishes on time. If we agree on that, we begin now." They all nodded. Those 6 months passed quickly, but each day carried weight. I worked side by side with the young engineers Madison had hired, teaching them step by step, sharing everything I knew: modular assembly, load sequencing, safety management. Madison didn't interfere. She mostly watched quietly. And little by little, I saw her learning to listen instead of just speak. Once, during our final monthly meeting, she stood before the whole team and said, "No one can lead if they don't understand the people holding the weight behind them." I learned that from Naomi. I didn't reply. I simply looked at her and nodded. Her words weren't a victory for me, they were proof that, finally, this structure could stand on its own, without me holding it up. When my consultancy term ended, I left as quietly as I came. No farewell party, no ceremony. Just an email to the entire staff with a short note and an attached report titled, "Sustaining the Structure." It was the 6-month manual I'd written, a blueprint for keeping things steady long after I was gone. At the very end, I added one final line. Any structure can stand tall if the people who build it learn to see one another. On my last day at the site, Madison came to see me off. She hugged me, saying nothing except a soft whisper. "I won't let it fall again." I smiled. "Then don't hold the company by its name. Hold it by the way you build." She nodded, eyes glistening. A month later, I returned to Red Rocks, the same place I used to come during the darkest years to think, to breathe, to dream of escape. That evening, the sunset was fierce, painting the cliffs in burning red light. I sat on the cold stone steps, watching the sun sink slowly, the steel keychain still in my hand. It was darker now, scratched, weathered, but still shining when the last rays touched it. I turned it in my palm and whispered, "I used to think freedom meant leaving. Now I know freedom is being able to return without losing yourself." The wind swept across the canyon, carrying the fading warmth of day. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear the rhythm of hammers, steel, and voices, the living heartbeat of the world I chose. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I belonged to a company or a family name. I belonged to the road I had built. And it, like me, was finally standing tall.